So, tonight we are going to be talking about a topic that to many seems controversial, but to us is a downright betrayal. And this is the normalization ties between Israel and the Arab states, which has recently included Bahrain, UAE, and Sudan. And tonight we have Hazem Jamjoum. We're very lucky to have him. Uh, so Hazim is a graduate student in Arab and Middle Eastern Studies at the American University of Beirut and in modern Middle East history at NYU. His writing has focused on political economy approaches to Israel colonialism and Palestinian elite formation and critiques of partition-based conflict management solutions, among other areas. Um, and I think I speak on all of our behalfs when I say we are very privileged to be joined with Hazem tonight. And I'm going to pass on to him now for the beginning of this event. So Hazem, over to you.
Thanks, Ron, and thanks everyone for coming and for the organizers. I'm going to ramble a little bit, but I really want to kind of keep it as brief as I can, because I really do want this to be as much of a discussion as possible. So I'm kind of a historian, so I'm going to be talking about the past a little bit more than I am about the present, but that's because I think that the past helps us understand how we got where we are today. And it's a little bit difficult to think of like, where do we begin, right? So I'm just going to start kind of with the beginning of British direct control over Palestine. So, you know, after World War I, the Ottoman Empire is divvied up between the victors of the war. And the British Empire takes over Palestine and Jordan. It had already been in control of Egypt, and then increasingly Iraq. And of course, it's a global empire with holdings all over the world. And what's particular about British occupation, military occupation of Palestine after 1918, 1920, is that the British have promised to support the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine to the kind of figurehead of the Zionist movement in the UK, Lord Rothschild. And so this sets in some ways, this is kind of where we can start the modern history of Palestine and the Zionist colonization of Palestine, even though that colonization begins before in terms of sending specifically European Jewish settlers to Palestine. This is where it kind of picks up, because now the Jewish Agency acts as a kind of de facto government of Jewish emigres into Palestine, and begins to conduct international relations on that basis, especially its relations with the British occupation. And here, we need to be careful when we think about the positioning of the Arab states, because there aren't that many Arab states. Most of these states are also now under European imperial occupation and colonization, right? So if we think about the countries of the Maghreb, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, they're under French control. Libya is engaged in a protracted struggle to get rid of the Italian occupation. And now it's going to pick up in the 20s and 30s as the fascist party takes over in Italy and sends over and really tries to entrench its own colonial presence in Libya as well as in Ethiopia. Egypt has been under British occupation at this point already for about 40 years, an occupation that would really kind of formally continue until the mid-1950s. Sudan is tied in to that story and remains a British imperial holding in one way or another, whether it's kind of as part of an Egyptian condominium or separately in the decades after the 1920s. The Gulf states aren't even called the Gulf states, they're called the Trucial states because they have truces signed with the British Empire, which is ostensibly kind of in control there as well. The discovery of oil also just kind of increases the importance of these places as logistical hubs, transportation hubs, but also as the century moves on, as oil producing places in themselves. Iraq and Transjordan, what becomes the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, are under British control. Syria and Lebanon are under French control. So the Arab world, when we talk about the Arab world and how they're relating to Palestine, isn't really a system of Arab states to speak of. It's a system of Arab notables, of Arab kind of upper class, powerful kind of nobilities or notabilities that are engaged either in confrontation with the local imperial regime or in cooperation and co-optation as part of that. And so as the decade kind of moves into the 1930s, we start to see kind of major uprisings, right, across the region. And these uprisings generally begin to identify with one another. So for instance, in the 1936 revolt in Palestine, a lot of the training and weapons and even some of the leaders came in from Syria and didn't see themselves necessarily as crossing a border they recognized when they crossed from what we now think of as Syria to what we now think of as Palestine. It was all part of one kind of more uncut up type territory where people and many of you or all of you probably already know this, but even later, like even into the 30s and 40s, people didn't see these borders as things that actually existed. The further back we go, the more these aren't borders at all, just things that people traverse between one town and another, between one village and another, to trade their goods, family ties, etc. So if we want to talk about kind of like how Arab states have approached the issue in Palestine, we need to recognize that the earlier we go in this century, the less we're actually talking about Arab states, and the more we're talking about something a lot more amorphous and something a lot more real in a way, right? It's about social bonds and about trade relations, about kind of how peoples and families have moved. And you'll see it even in kind of people's family names, right? Just if we take Palestine as one very tiny example, people have family names that indicate Bushnaq, they're from Bosnia, El-Masri from Egypt, and so on and so forth, right? And so we see this kind of, if you want to call it cosmopolitanism or heterogeneity. Of course, these only become heterogeneous and cosmopolitan after the fact of these borders. Before that, it was just the normal state of affairs, right? So this is one point to kind of think of. The second is when we think about these notabilities themselves and how they position themselves regarding imperial power. So obviously the first building block we have here is that imperial power, in this case, British imperial power, but also the other imperial powers, very much immediately side with the Zionist movement, right? So the Zionist movement is very much supported by the British Empire, very much formally and legally, and not just in some kind of emotional sense. And so the Arab nobles and notabilities in Palestine and around Palestine in what would become the Arab world also have to position themselves vis-a-vis Zionism, thinking also about how they're positioning themselves vis-a-vis empire, vis-a-vis the local European imperial power, right? And so when we look at, for example, the resistance movements that emerged in the 20s and 30s, some of the initial resistance to that resistance came from Palestinian nobles, right? This is very much a class struggle from the very beginning. And so you have, for example, the Nashashibi family has completely tied in its lot with the British Empire. The Husseini family, and we're talking about the biggest land-owning families, right? I'm not just picking families at random here. The Husseini family, which is considered kind of the biggest Jerusalem family, and Amin al-Husseini kind of tries to position himself as the leader of the Palestinians. He's one of the first people to try to clamp down on any kind of resistance, because this is the kind of thing that creates headaches for him in his relations with the British Empire. And it's actually through the workings of these nobles that the 1936 general strike, so some of you might know, in 1936, and as an act of major resistance to the British military occupation, but also of Zionist colonization, call a general strike, and it's one of the longest, if not the longest and most sustained general strike in 20th century history worldwide. It lasts for over 6 months. This is quashed not just by British policing action. This is quashed also by co-optation of the nobles, co-optation of the large landowners and the rich Palestinians. Once it's quashed, it actually moves out into the countryside as an armed insurrection that lasts until 1939. And even then, it's a lot of the nobles and what we would think of as a kind of the rich class and the propertied class amongst Palestinians, but also now by kind of neighboring Arab elites. And so they rely very much on the Hashemites in Jordan, the British, I mean, rely very much on the Hashemites in Jordan to exert pressure to end this insurrection. In addition to, of course, the British and Zionist military and policing action that results in the arrest and exile and murder and execution of hundreds and thousands of Palestinian leaders and organizers and activists and militants. 1948 offers us another example of thinking about kind of the Arab states and their role in this. The Zionist narrative, which became quite dominant for most of the 20th century after 1948, is a narrative of this fledgling state of refugees from Europe of Jewish refugees from the Holocaust, tried to create their own kind of self-determination state and their own independence. And then all of these massive Arab states and Arab armies attacked. And then we had a David and Goliath story where this little state managed to kind of fend itself off and establish a state. What actually kind of happened is that the Zionist expulsions of Palestinians begin right away, right after the UN passes its partition resolution in November 19. Actually, we're coming up on the anniversary of it in November of 1947. The Zionist leadership considers this kind of enough legitimacy to then declare a state, and they begin the forced and systematic expulsion of Palestinians. Before any Arab armies invade in the middle of May in 1948, the Zionist forces have already expelled half of those who would become the Palestinian refugees of 1948, right? So that just factually kind of has pushed back against that Zionist narrative, and hopefully you all kind of are familiar enough with all of this. But the key thing to think about here also is just like that partition resolution, how it was supported. And it was supported by, for example, the Soviet bloc. The first state to recognize Israel was the Soviet Union, right? What would become considered the radical and revolutionary wing of the international state system is actually kind of immediately the first one that comes in and adopts the idea of partition, right? Which is at the heart of our problem. The idea that this very heterogeneous society of Palestine, which included Jewish, Christian, Muslim, atheist, etc., that it belongs to only one kind of person, a person who can legally be defined as Jewish, that this is the only sort of rightful inhabitant of this land. This is what I mean by partition. And so the communist parties, Arab communist parties, are immediately instructed by Moscow to have this line, right? To toe the line of partition and to accept Zionism, basically to normalize relations with Zionism. And so, and actually, you know, to their credit, the Iraqi Communist Party is possibly the only, and this is including the Palestinian Communist Party, by the way, the Iraqi Communist Party is the only one that said, no, we're not going to follow this dictate, and they're expelled from the kind of the Soviet International until they toe the line and are accepted back in. And it's in this period of the 40s and 50s that we begin to actually have an Arab state system, right? It's in this period that countries like Egypt, Jordan, etc., declare independence, mostly by maintaining a particular kind of relation with their erstwhile colonizers. We don't have mass-scale anti-colonial revolutions in this period, except in a very particular number of countries, right? The Maghreb is very important. It's most notable here, Algeria, who wage a very long and very protracted anti-colonial revolution against the French Empire. And in Morocco and Tunisia, you have large mass movements against French Empire. And of course, you have movements against imperialism and empire across the region. But most of these states gain their independence through some kind of negotiated process where they are kind of granted independence, usually in return for a maintenance of economic and military ties with the former colonizer, right? And this continues to mark the Arab state system until today, right? So when we think of Jordan, when we think of the Gulf states, when we think of you know, in particular the Gulf states, Jordan, etc., the monarchies, we're thinking about states where there was this kind of negotiated arrangement to declare independence, but maintain a very strong tie, including in foreign policy, to the colonial power. And now we've entered into the era of the Cold War, right? And so this is why I had mentioned the Soviet Union. The era of the Cold War, specifically the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, the Arab political state system is effectively recast as the revolutionary regimes, which are generally ones that overthrew either a monarchy or, like in the case of Libya, or overthrew directly the colonial power and established some kind of republic or kind of socialist republic, like in Algeria. What we see in this period is that the Arab state system is effectively split on how to handle Zionism, how to relate to Zionism. Now, there is a consensus that we have to be kind of anti-Zionist, right? That what the Zionists did in Palestine is wrong. We oppose it. Palestine must be liberated. However, how to go about that is generally kind of takes these, in broad strokes, two lines. One is a kind of pro-American line, right? Which is that, like, we should really sort of use diplomacy, right? Use our alliances with the United States to try to force Israel's hand, to try to apply some kind of pressure. And meanwhile, the revolutionary regimes, so kind of the Ba'ath regimes in Iraq and Syria, Algeria, socialist Yemen, when these emerge, revolutionary Oman, even though that didn't kind of fully take over Oman, and that revolution was quashed in the 70s. But revolutionary movements in the Arab world have constantly seen this as a confrontation. You don't just get handed things, you have to take them. And you take them by raising the cost of empire, raising the cost of occupation, and forcing the colonizer out. And this rift really kind of takes its toll on, or is reflected in Palestinian politics. By the mid-60s, Palestinians have the Palestine Liberation Organization. After the 1967 war, the militant factions take over the Palestine Liberation Organization. And immediately, this split between a kind of revolutionary approach and a kind of conciliatory diplomatic approach is reflected directly into the PLO. The right wing of the PLO, or the Fatah, and its kind of crony parties. The PLO also includes a lot of Palestinian political factions that are actually just front organizations for intelligence services of Arab regimes, right? So you have the Arab Liberation Front, which is the Iraqi Ba'ath Party's front group. You have the Sa'iqa, which is the Syrian intelligence's front group. And these are actually like political factions with seats in the Palestinian parliament, the Palestinian National Council. So they're just kind of following their HQ's line. But the main point I want to make here is that the Palestinian right, headed by Fatah and Yasser Arafat, is effectively seeking to steer Palestinians in a way where they will accept the kind of the US route of a diplomatic strategy. This is based on a very kind of pragmatic, realist type approach, which is that in the present moment, the balance of power means that Israel and its backers are just infinitely more militarily powerful. They're militarily superior to anything that the Palestinians and their allies are going to be muster in the near future. And so what Arafat does is he allies himself as closely as possible with those that are willing to give him money. And this is mostly the Gulf states and others, of course. But the main point here is that, especially after the 1967 war, you begin to have the contours of an idea of what the long-term solution would look like. And there's a consensus recognition that Palestinians will never accept this. The Palestinian people will never accept it because it's based on partition. The idea is that Israel would withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza Strip, which it occupied in 1967. That kind of the Golan Heights is Syria's problem, Shab'a Farms are Lebanon's problem. Palestinians won't kind of deal with those kinds of things. Palestinian leadership will forget about Palestinian citizens of Israel in 48, and will also kind of silently forget about Palestinian refugees, who are 70% of the Palestinian population, right? Let's never forget that 7 out of every 10 Palestinians is a displaced person. It's the largest and longest standing refugee struggle in the world, and has been for decades. The crucial moment here comes in 1974. Right? In 1974, what happens is Fatah comes to the Palestinian National Council, the Palestinian Parliament, which is the highest decision-making body in the PLO, and says, and offers something called a 10-point program. And there's kind of two things in the 10-point program that are really essential. One is that the PLO will now accept liberation of any part of Palestine. And the idea in theory is that in the long run, this would be the launching pad for a next stage where more of the territory would be liberated. And maybe one day Palestinians who are in 48 Palestine will become part of the Palestinian body politic again. And refugees maybe one day also would get to return. But let's not talk about it now. For now, we just want any piece of Palestine in which we can plant a flag and have all of the charade and pageantry of being an independent state. This passes. Arafat manages to pass this through the Palestinian National Council. This results in 13 factions actually leaving the PLO, called Jabhat al-Rafid, the kind of refusal front. And they don't join back in until the Camp David agreements at the end of the 1970s for other reasons. Immediately, and there's no coincidence here, as soon as this passes, Arafat is invited to the Rabat summit of the Arab League, where he is declared the sole legitimate representative. The PLO is declared the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, right? On the basis that they're now willing to do the diplomatic compromise of the two-state solution. Right? This is entirely new and is seen as treason. You know, Hamdallah, Najil Ali, if you look at Najil Ali's cartoons from the period all the way until his assassination, one of the main things that he's attacking is that line that we would accept partition of Palestine, which would basically nullify the refugee struggle, nullify Palestinian citizens of Israel. Immediately after the Arab League adopts the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, Arafat is invited to the UN General Assembly to give his famous gun and olive branch speech, and where the PLO is granted observer status at the United Nations, which is the same status as it had had since then. So if we want to be kind of really kind of crass about it, 1974 marks the beginning of a new phase in the Palestinian struggle, a phase where the leadership at the top, very top of which is Yasser Arafat, is effectively trying to play the Palestinian people and kind of shepherd them to a position where they will accept partition, where they will accept no more than parts of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, where he can kind of effectively be the king. And his main backers are actually, again, the Palestinian notability. They're the Palestinian millionaires and billionaires, the people who are in the CCC company. We can name their names and are the main money bags. Actually, the fastest way to see it is just to see who sat on something called the Palestine National Fund. This was effectively the big Palestinian billionaires. And these were the main people who continued to push this line. So these were also his main backers for the Oslo agreements, which I'll talk about in a moment. Something else very important happens here, which is that Israel has long recognized that the main objective of Israeli foreign policy is to neutralize Egypt, right? That Egypt is the biggest military threat and diplomatic threat to Zionism. And so they get the godsend of Anwar Sadat, who takes power in 1970 after the death of Jamal Abdel Nasser. And Sadat sets Egypt on a course to effectively join the pro-US camp in the Cold War. Nasser had made Egypt one of the leading countries in the non-aligned movement, which was to say, okay, this is Soviet versus US. This is a bigger game than us. We don't want to play this game. We, Indonesia, Yugoslavia, these kind of middle powers and the rest of the world, the global south, we don't want to have any business in fighting your proxy wars. And so Nasser was kind of central to this. And this was more a kind of closer to the Soviets than to the Americans, closer to socialism than to full free market capitalism. Sadat wants to effectively join the US camp. And so he leverages what he sells as a victory in the 1973 Yom Kippur War to lead to the negotiating table that results in the Camp David agreements. And exactly like the Saudi line that we heard over the G20 summit over the past few days, he said, I'm not going to sign an agreement with Israel until they guarantee Palestinian autonomy. right? And so the Camp David agreements actually had two branches. They had the branch which was kind of land for peace, giving Sinai back to Egypt in return for peace and normalization of relations with Israel. And another track, which was the Palestinian autonomy track. The Palestinian autonomy track fails miserably, but it has a very interesting unintended consequence. The Israelis begin to plan for the contingency of having to grant Palestinians something that looks like autonomy. And so they develop a project called the Village Leagues, or Rawabit al-Qura, which they had started from 1976, but which the Likud party, after they win the election in 1978, 1979, begins to actually implement. And this is to take effectively collaborators, Palestinian collaborators, and set them up in an institutional governance structure called the Village Leagues, which would act as intermediary between Palestinians in the West Bank and Israeli military authority. Right? This is actually when Israel sets up al-Idara al-Madaniyya, the civil administration, which is effectively the arm of the Israeli military that deals with Palestinian civilian affairs, right? And this is the mainstay of Palestinian life over the past 40, 50 years. Palestinians conduct an uprising. There's an intifada in 1981 that we've all forgotten. And this intifada was against the Village Leagues, and it was a successful intifada. They actually destroy the Village Leagues, right? Within a year. What's interesting about the Village Leagues, though, is that the way that they are structured, the way that they're actually written up on paper in terms of what their authority is going to be, is exactly that which becomes the Palestinian Authority with the Oslo agreements. Right? So then what scholars would call a native authority, right? What under British imperial kind of playbook is called indirect rule, basically find local collaborators that you can prop up as the local government that becomes the first line of defense for the colonizer, right? They basically play the role of prison warden, not leader of a liberation struggle. The important shift from the Village Leagues in the early 1980s to Oslo, that moment, what changes is that Israel manages to force the PLO, the leadership of the liberation struggle, Arafat himself, to sign on to becoming the Village League. And Arafat is doing this on the basis of a strategy. It's not that Arafat doesn't want Palestinian freedom. Don't misunderstand me. Arafat sees, he's so much of a pragmatist, he's not willing to wait. He's not willing to wait to build power so that Palestinians one day when things change are able to actually get their rights by fighting for them. He wants something now. And under the now balance of power, where Palestinians are completely militarily outmatched, the only thing that he can leverage is diplomatic power. And so the maximum Palestinians managed to gain from this strategy that starts in 1974 of leveraging diplomatic power is to become prison wardens over their own population. And not even their entire population, just that part of the population in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And as of 2007, 2008, it's not even the West Bank and Gaza Strip, it's just about 30% of the West Bank. The Gaza Strip now has its own authority headed by the Hamas faction, right? And so this ushers in the Oslo agreements. So when you see those lists of Arab states that have normalized relations with Israel, it goes Egypt 1978, 1979, Jordan, Wadi Araba Agreement 1994, and then it jumps forward to Saudi and, to Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates and now Sudan. It's missing the most important one, which is the PLO, right? The PLO was the second Arab body to normalize relations with Israel and with Zionism, right? We can't forget it because that effectively is what opened the door to Jordan signing, right? Jordan doesn't just go in and sign Wadi Araba. Jordan has had relations under the table with Israel from 1948. This is documented, right? You can look up a book called Collusion Across the Jordan by Professor Avi Schleim, where effectively King Abdullah of Jordan the First had made a deal with Golda Meir and David Ben Gurion where he said, okay, I'll take the West Bank, you guys take whatever else you want. The only thing they couldn't agree on was Jerusalem, and that's the only place where the Jordanian forces actually fought against the Zionist forces in the 1948 war, right? And won, by the way, right? They kept the old city of Jerusalem. Okay, so from this moment on, also, we can know, because now the Cold War is over, we can no longer properly speak about radical or revolutionary Arab regimes and reactionary ones. We can only talk about reactionary Arab regimes. Even the ones that still don the mantle of revolutionary something or other, like the Ba'ath parties in Iraq and Syria, insofar as they're interested in Palestine, it's the rhetoric of Palestine as they oppress their own populations. The most clear example of this is in Syria, where the main branch of Syrian intelligence that deals with internal domestic dissidents and political opposition is called Fir' Falastin, right? So they've called their own, basically like the own wing of the internal intelligence arm responsible for torture and murder and imprisonment of Syrian dissidents or any dissidents in Syria is called the Palestine branch of the Syrian military and intelligence services, right? This is one example of many, but we know the rhetoric. We know Gaddafi's rhetoric about Palestine. We know Saddam sent a couple of rockets over to Tel Aviv in his kind of like last stand in 1990. So they're paying lip service to the idea of Palestine as a legitimation, a way to legitimize their own authoritarian regimes. And actually to the point where you will have heard some Arabs from countries like Libya, Syria, etc., of, man, I don't want to have anything to do with Palestine. The only time I hear stuff to do with Palestine is when our leaders, who are putting our people in jail and oppressing us and not allowing us to speak, not allowing us to organize, not allowing us to express ourselves, are the ones who want to talk about Palestine. What do I have to do with it, right? I want to have freedom in my own country. And so this becomes the dynamic. We have only reactionary Arab regimes. And in the case of these reactionary Arab regimes, with very few exceptions, and specifically I can think of Algeria and to some extent Yemen, and Sudan before it was effectively bought by the Saudis recently, right? When it was still a regime that still represented some of those kind of foreign policy type ideals, Arabist ideals of the Sudanese people. These regimes are effectively just waiting to formally normalize relations with Israel, because that becomes the royal avenue to normalizing relations and beefing up relations with the United States. The US had made this a precondition. So if you look at free trade agreements that the United States signed with any of these Arab regimes, they effectively stipulate as a precondition that they engage in economic relations with Israel. It doesn't necessarily say that you have to have them publicly. And so all of these states, all the Gulf states, for example, open up ties with Israel already, already since the 90s and early 2000s. They begin normalizing relations with Israel. They just don't do it publicly. It's all done under the table, right? And this is something we need to recognize, is that what's happened in the last months, this Abraham Accords, Sudan, etc., this isn't a turning point. This isn't something new. These are relations that already existed. What is new is that now we're at a point where they feel no shame to do this, where they feel powerful enough internally within their own states, in terms of their relation to their own populations, that they can do this publicly and that they can quash any opposition to it that comes from their population. So what's also interesting now, and this is almost a welcome thing, is that now Palestine, instead of rhetorically signifying, Hafez al-Assad's support for liberation of Palestine while he beats the shit out of his own population, Palestine now belongs where it actually belongs, as a symbol of populations and peoples in their struggle for their own democracy and freedoms, right? Palestine can resume its rightful place as a symbol of actual freedom, not of oppression and repression within the Arab world. So I'll leave it there for now, but I'm hoping that our discussion will kind of bring out, because there is of course a lot more to say about all of this. But I will say one last final thing though. The relationship of Israel's allies to Israel in the past, as in the present, but very much so in the past, actually follows something that Theodor Herzl wrote near the end of his life. Basically, he was trying to sell European empires on support for Zionism. And what he said is, look, if you let us create this Zionist state in Palestine, then we will be a bulwark, right? A military garrison, effectively, of civilization against barbarism. Now, forget, of course, the Orientalist and racist language that's inherent in this. The idea is that Israel would be the forward guard, the vanguard, the military vanguard of Western capitalist interests in the Middle East, and a guarantor of Western domination and hegemony in that region, right, in the East and South Mediterranean. That's still the case. What's interesting now, however, is that, and at the time, basically the Western states had to hold their nose and look the other way when it came to just the racism and apartheid that was built into the Israeli system. They had to hold their nose, but also remember that most of these global powers, United States, Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, are themselves settler colonies. So they are also settler colonial regimes that have apartheid laws to effectively eliminate any possible resistance from their native populations. So they have that kind of alliance. And let's remember that it's European empires that built those states and instituted those laws, right? So even if Britain itself is not per se England, a settler colony, it's British imperialism that set up those settler colonies like New Zealand, etc., including Israel. That's one thing. The new thing that's developed is that Israeli apartheid and the way that Israel has managed to effectively square the circle, to legislate apartheid while pretending to be the only democracy in the Middle East, right? While pretending to be a liberal democratic system, that now is a model, right? This is also new and dangerous. We saw this most clearly in the supporters of the Donald Trump campaigns in 2016 who are still around. This idea of identitarianism, the idea that not make America great again, make America white again, right? This idea of we need to have something that protects whiteness. You saw it around Brexit in the UK as well, right? You see Nigel Farage kind of pushing this line all the time, right? This idea that we need to be able to kind of like, without necessarily making it too clear what we're doing, we need to protect whiteness. We need to save whiteness, right? And we need to be able to do it institutionally. We need to institutionalize whiteness as hegemonic so that these darkies don't come in and change it, right? This is crucial. Israel has become the model for that, right? Now, people will publicly say, well, I mean, they'll publicly say one of two things. One, if they are criticized, they say, well, Israel does it. Why are you criticizing me for doing it? Right? I remember hearing the Polish foreign minister defend their draconian immigration and refugee policies on Hard Talk on the BBC, saying, well, Israel does that. We have basically a similar immigration refugee system as they do. You can't criticize me for it. So that's one thing. The second thing is to say, well, Israel's actually the model that we're going to follow. Right? And so we're going to send our police forces to go get training from Israelis on how to police Black people. We're going to go get training from the Israelis on how to develop laws in a way that looks liberal, but is in fact apartheid and maintains the privileges created by settler colonialism, right? And so this is the other thing to be aware of, is that when we talk about things like the Gulf states, when we talk about a country like the United Arab Emirates or Bahrain or Saudi Arabia, these are countries that actually you wouldn't need to be a legal genius to argue that they are countries that commit apartheid. When you talk about countries where 10 to 20% of the population holds actual citizenship, the rest of the population is migrant labor and exists on a actually legislated grade system, often depending on the color of their skin and their origin, right? If you're South Asian or Black, you're at the bottom of the scale. If you're Arab, you're somewhere just a step up from that. If you're white and blue-eyed and have one of those fancy Western passports, then you're just one step below the citizens, right? To have an actual apartheid system legislated as such, especially when it comes to labor, right? You can see the affinity. You can see the affinity between a state that is a settler colony bent on eliminating the native Palestinian population, legislating in order to do so, and another state that wants to maintain the privileges of kind of those labeled as citizens, right, the muwatnin of a country like the United Arab Emirates, to continue to be able to exploit the labor. That's the only difference here, is that the labor isn't indigenous, the labor is migrant labor. This is also, there's the issue of the Bidun, right, who are indigenous from the Gulf region, but have been rendered stateless and are not given statehood and regularized citizenship. So So in terms of its relation to Bidun and in terms of their relationship to migrant labor, there's a vested interest in allowing legislation of apartheid type laws and policies and practices. So that's another thing to kind of keep in mind when we think about why would a country like the United Arab Emirates be developing such a strong bond of alliance with Israel. Obviously, there's the realpolitik of enmity towards Iran, etc. But again, that existed before they formally normalized, right? The trade relations existed before they formally normalized. The things that have changed, the things that are enabled, is basically to open the door to Gulf investment in Israel, Gulf investment in using Israeli technology, Gulf investment in using the Israeli military forces as part of their own defense strategies, and to use this alliance to further legitimize and normalize apartheid on a global level. I'll stop there.
Thank you very, very much, Hazem, for such like a wonderful talk. And I think I can speak for everyone and say that there were lots of things that I've learned that I previously didn't even know about the topic. So thank you very much for that. So now what we're going to do is Lamis and I will be having some like host discussions with Hazem. So we'll be asking him a couple of questions. And in doing so, hopefully it'll give you guys some time to come up with some questions for the Q&A section. So Hazem, I wanted to first ask you, like, what can we as students in the UK and in the wider Western world do to make an effective stance against these deals?
Well, there's a lot that can be done, honestly. First of all, I think we should never downplay the importance of awareness raising, outreach, and education, right? And this starts with educating yourselves within your group, even yourself as an individual, your family, your neighbors, your friend group. This is essential, right? The successes of all other campaigns depend on having a body, not just of supporters. One of the problems we've had in the past, and actually I see this as one of the problems in the Arab world and the Muslim world, is that people treat Palestine like it's the thing they support naturally by birth, the way that you would root for your local football team, you know? So it's not based on a deep awareness and education of the history and the processes and the different type, like nature of the struggle. You actually find that people think of it as almost, okay, there's these two countries, Palestine and Israel, they're at war. The Palestinians are Muslims or Arabs or whatever, they're more like me, and so I'm going to support them. This is completely wrong. Right? This is not how you do solidarity. It's not how you think of solidarity. Solidarity needs to be based on an actual engagement and knowledge, and shouldn't actually be solidarity. You should see this as participation. And one of the main reasons you should see this as participation is that Israel's allies, locally in the UK, elsewhere, etc., are the same people who are responsible for things like blood diamonds and gentrification and Brexit and kind of increased racism and policing and incarceration. They already see themselves as an alliance, right? See who is the most vociferous supporters of Israel and see what their domestic policies are in a place like the UK or the US. And you'll find that the domestic kind of people doing harm and encouraging racism and xenophobia and imprisonment and treating all issues as policing issues and militarization of the police are the same people who are supporters of Israel, right? So this is one thing. The second thing is what kind of activism and organizing you can be doing. And here, there really is a lot. One is, and this is maybe the unexpected one, but I'll start with it anyway, is actually be part of local struggles, right? Aside from Palestine, but seeing them as part of one and the same struggle, be part of those struggles to understand. We've had this huge uprising against the militarization of police and mass incarceration. Learn about these struggles, the issues relating to the environment. These are also connected, right? The same industries that Israel is part of supporting, these same blocks of right-wing racists are also the ones that are like, okay, free market, go do your thing. We don't care about the environment, very short-termist. And about profit maximization and profit over people. Be part of those struggles, educate yourselves about these struggles. In terms of Israel specifically, Israeli companies and companies doing business with Israel are all around us in the UK, right? They surround you. You have investment portfolios in your own universities where there are pension funds and university investments and endowment investments that go into Israeli companies. In many cases, actually, arms companies. Third, Britain is one of the main supporters of Israel. It's not just the Balfour Declaration 1917, over 100 years ago. That has continued for over a century. One of the most egregious of these is the arms trade, right? Britain continues to sell arms to a country that is explicitly and documentedly committing human rights violations and crimes against humanity, especially the crime of apartheid. This has to stop. I mean, even by British law, this is illegal, right? And so agitating to bring that to people's attention and to end agreements, I want to remind you, with crimes against humanity, so apartheid is a crime against humanity as defined in the Rome Statute, right? Which Britain is a signatory of. If a state commits a crime against humanity, like apartheid, it creates an obligation, not an option. It creates an obligation on all actors in the international system, whether they are states or civilians or institutions or organizations, whatever they are. There's an obligation on them to do everything in their power to stop that crime from being committed. i.e., we all have a legal obligation to stop doing business with Israel until it ceases to be an apartheid state, right? So you're on very strong legal grounds. Now it's about how do you creatively organize to enforce that, right? And the most egregious stuff is that we're actually selling Israel the weapons it uses to kill Palestinians, right? It's a really clear-cut type of case. And there's an incredible organization in London called War on Want that has really spearheaded a lot of the work on ending the arms trade with Israel and Saudi Arabia, by the way.
Thank you for that, Hazem. So I wanted to also ask more to do with the role that the US has in the Middle East, and especially with Israel, and like how Trump systematically worked to dismantle the Oslo peace process and mounted a full frontal assault on the Land for Peace formula and essentially threw that down the drain. So bearing in mind that we now have Biden, who would be next year's president, and he claims to be a proud Zionist, but he also aims to salvage the US-Palestinian relation. Do you think that we'll see a difference in the change between like the American relation with the Middle East, or do you think that Biden won't care as much about forcing, not necessarily forcing, but persuading places like the Saudi state to formally make a stronger relation with Israel, or do you think that won't be part of the plan?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a lot I want to say to this, especially about the initial premise. Trump did not destroy Land for Peace and this stuff that you were talking about. That was already dead. That was dead actually from the moment, like it was never really born. It was always disingenuous. We can think of the Israeli politics as two wings, a far right and an extreme right. Yeah, the far right has been advocating apartheid as the strategy for the long-term sustainability of Israel. What do I mean by that? The Bantustan solution, the Oslo solution, right? Where we'll give Palestinians little morsels of land that Israel completely controls, and where Israel controls their economy, controls their foreign policy, controls their military, controls their borders, in return for normalization of relations with the entire region and with the Palestinians, right? That's the apartheid solution. That was Rabin. That was the position that Ariel Sharon recognized late in life. And remember, Ariel Sharon is not just a war criminal. Ariel Sharon is one of the greatest masterminds Israel has had, right? And so he knew exactly that this apartheid solution was the way that we would ensure the longevity of the Zionist project into the medium and long-term future. The extreme right is not interested in apartheid. The Likud party, Netanyahu's party, the party Ariel Sharon split from when he did that, are not interested in the apartheid system. The Likud party objected to the erection of the apartheid wall. Why did the Likud party object to the apartheid wall? Because it would place a limit to Israeli expansion. If you put a wall outside of Nablus, that means that Israel doesn't get to, in 20 years, just take Nablus. It makes it harder because they've set in a border on the ground. That's the party that's been in power for over 10 years. And over the last 20, 30 years, they've been in power most of the time, right? You need to recognize this, that the leadership of the Zionist movement right now, and remember that the main challengers to Netanyahu are not from the far right. They're from the extreme, extreme, extreme right. It's Avigdor Lieberman. It's people who want to be even more outspoken about getting rid of Palestinian citizens of Israel, not just Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Right? That's the dynamic of Israeli politics for the last while. These people have not been pushing for land for peace or for acceleration of a creation of a Palestinian state or anything of the sort. Their end goal is elimination of Palestinian presence in Palestine entirely, and they've been explicit about it, right? They do not hide it. They are very explicit about it. What Trump did, which was not what Obama did, was that he basically was like, okay, I don't want to have to deal with the Middle East. I want to pull out all of my forces from the Middle East. This is too expensive for me. Israel, first of all, like Saudi, what do you want? I want your money, right? We remember seeing how Trump and Mohammed bin Salman, I mean, the first trip that Trump made outside of the US was to Saudi. He didn't even go to Mexico or Canada or any of the usual places US presidents go to because he wanted money. And he made it very crassly clear when he held up that like board and said, I'm making 700 billion on this one and 300 million on that one. Very embarrassing, I think, from Mohammed bin Salman. But really it was, okay, Netanyahu, what do you want? What can I do to make your life easier so that you can just finish this and I can declare peace in the Middle East kind of thing, and declare this over. And that's where we got the defunding of UNRWA, the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem, et cetera, et cetera. So let's just rephrase the question, right? Of like, just is anything going to change from Trump to Biden? The land for peace thing has been dead for years and years and years. That's not an option. People who are still thinking that there's going to be a two-state solution, you're living in an illusion. There was never going to be a two-state solution, ever. The difference between Trump and Biden as regards the Middle East is almost none, right? The main difference is going to be that Trump was heavily invested in getting Saudi money to pay for all of his own deficits. Biden is going to be a little bit less invested in giving Mohammed bin Salman and Netanyahu everything that they want, right? Those alliances are going to remain, those special relationships are going to remain. The trend to push for normalization with Arab states predates Trump and will continue after Trump. So the least affected region in the world by the change of power from Trump to Biden directly is the Middle East. There is going to be no change. Biden, Kamala Harris, the Democratic Party, I mean, even the best that the Democratic Party has to offer, Bernie Sanders, was just kind of like willing to critique Israel, right? That's where he moved the bar. He's willing to critique it when it commits egregious violations of human rights. He was never going to be this force to push and confront Israel and try to get it to give up anything. It's just that he didn't want them to be committing egregious violations of human rights. And at most, he was going to wag the finger, right? And say, naughty Israel, you shouldn't do that. Which would have been also interpreted as anti-Semitism. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, that is a big deal when a US president critiques Israel for egregious human rights violations because of the nature of that relationship where Israel can do no wrong. It has blanket protection. We're never allowed to critique it. The same policy that the British government, I don't know why we have to go to Trump and Biden. The Boris Johnson government, I mean, just Jeremy Corbyn, right? Just got expelled from the party and not allowed back in over some notion that he's an anti-Semite, right? Which is the farthest thing from the truth, obviously, like as his record very clearly shows, because he was willing to critique Israel, right? And this new head of the Labour Party, he's just come in and he's established his credentials, is that he's going to fall in with Trump, Biden, Boris Johnson, etc., which is no critique of Israel ever under any circumstances.
Thank you very much, Hazem. So I think we'll move on to Q&A from now on. We've got quite a few questions in the chat box. Roman, do you want to read them out?
Yes, so I think the first question we have So thoughts on the power of online boycott and online revolutionary mobilization in Egypt, Sudan, Lebanon, etc. Historically speaking, from 2011 onwards. So I think they're asking what your thoughts on those.
Okay, I mean, the word online is throwing me a little bit. Anything online isn't really real, right? The effectiveness of online is not to say that this isn't real, but it's cultural, i.e. it's in our heads. It's very useful for informing. It's very useful for educating. Like even the ad that UCL SJP posted for this event, where it had those stats on the popularity and actually the unpopularity, the mass unpopularity of normalization in the Arab world, that's informative, right? That arms us. This kind of information arms us. Online also enables us to see news very quickly, whether it's on Twitter, Instagram, or otherwise. Reading articles and things. That's when I was talking about self-awareness, awareness, education, self-education, education of others, outreach, mobilization in this way. This is very important, and online tools have become basically better than almost all other tools because they can reach really far, really quickly. You can save it for later. It doesn't have the same kind of environmental impact as leafleting, and so that's important. But I don't know what an online boycott is, like not going to an Israeli website. That's not really an online boycott, right? Boycott is you stop buying certain things, you get investments to be withdrawn and to be dropped. You set up a picket line effectively that stops the movement and says, this is not legitimate, it's not normal, and we're not going to deal with it until it stops being criminal, right? Stopping a football team from playing, stopping a musical performance, not because we hate music or we're against people performing or whatever, but to highlight you don't get to be a normal music band when you're officially representing the state of Israel and its foreign ministry, like the Bat Sheva dance troupe. You don't get to be a normal football team and just come and play in London like no big deal, because you're officially representing the state of Israel, a state that is committing ongoing crimes, apartheid being one of them, right? And so that's what underlies the idea of boycott and divestment, right? Of withdrawing those investments, stopping those investments, trying to have an effect on the bottom line, on profiteering off of apartheid. Remember, every cent Israel or any Israeli company makes is money made, is blood money, is our blood's money, right? Is money made on the crime of apartheid, even if it's not a military company. The sheer fact of its existence in that space that was stolen from us and we were forcibly expelled from and not allowed to return, right? That entire legal regime, that entire social political regime is premised on our dispossession and murder and the elimination of Palestinians. That's the crime, right? And until that's addressed, we can't deal with these things as if they're normal. That's what's criminal also about Bahrain and UAE and Sudan, and Egypt and the PLO and Jordan. Normalizing relations with Israel is there. That's why we say normalizing. That's why we say tatbiya. Because what you're doing when you open up these relations is you say, I'm going to deal with you like you're normal, but you're not normal, right? And that's why boycott, BDS, etc., are called anti-normalization efforts. They're anti-normalization because they're saying, you don't get to be treated as normal until you behave normal, right? And this isn't about normativity. This is about your being criminal until you stop being criminal, until you stop immiserating people criminally, you don't get to be treated as normal. And so I don't know how much of that can happen online, right? Yeah, I hope I've answered the question though.
Thank you very much. So Lamis, do you want to take the next question?
Okay, so the next question is, so given that Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Bahrain perceive Iran as a existential threat and that Israel is the only nuclear power in the region able to protect them from Iran, do you think that further alignment between Israeli and Arab interests will be inevitable in the near future? And do you foresee a peace agreement between Israel and Saudi anytime soon? If so, what do you think the implications will be for Palestine?
Just Hazem, just before you answer that, I think this, I'm not singling out this this specific question, but just in general, we should be very cautious about the language we use, especially when we say the words peace to describe something that is anything but peaceful. And that's the type of rhetoric that just unfortunately subconsciously influences the way global audiences think of that, and that has a negative effect. So normalization deal is probably the best term.
So
thank you, Saif. That's a very good
took
point.
the words right out of my mouth. Yeah. So none of these are peace agreements. Oslo wasn't a peace agreement. Camp David wasn't a peace agreement, right? These are normalization agreements. And so I don't. I'm not the best person to speak on some of this stuff. I don't fully understand what is this hyped up. I'm no friend of the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is not a regime that appeals to me. It is just as authoritarian as many of the other regimes in the region. And its role outside of its borders, whether in Syria or in Lebanon or elsewhere, I don't think has been necessarily positive. Just as the US and Britain and Saudi involvement in these places has not been positive. They are operating on their own geopolitical interests, and these are not the interests of us regular folk, right? From the perspective of regular folk, however, I do not see what this looming Iranian threat against the Saudis or the Bahrainis is. I think that both, these authoritarian regimes need to go, and they need to go on the terms set by their own people, right? That's ultimately what I'm interested in, is how do the people of the region in Iran, in Bahrain, in the Emirates, etc., get to live with dignity, in Palestine, get to live with dignity, right? And that's really the perspective I want to see things from. And I'm much less interested in seeing them from kind of the autocrats' perspective, because I think that's part of how they kind of like bamboozle us, is for us to start thinking about things like, oh, but like, let's think of it from Mohammed bin Salman's perspective. Why do I need to think about things from Mohammed bin Salman's perspective? Do I foresee a normalization deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia? I don't know. I mean, like, yeah, sure, 50-50, right? It could happen. It's effectively in place, right? This is the thing that we just need to remember, is it's a difference of, are they going public with it or not? Saudi was one of the first to have relations with Israel from the Gulf states. And it's the one that's pushed everybody else to. No, Bahrain doesn't sign a normalization agreement with Israel without a green light from Saudi. The Emirates doesn't sign a normalization agreement with Israel. And Sudan definitely had zero thoughts of signing a normalization deal with, they were forced to by the Saudis, right? We all know this, it's the unspoken secret, it's not even a secret, right? At the G20, there was the Israeli education minister came out and said that Netanyahu had a meeting with Mohammed bin Salman, and then all hell broke loose, that no, he didn't. Of course he did. But even if he didn't, like, it's not about them two talking. Those relations exist. If they're going to formalize it or not, that's a calculation that Riyadh is going to make based on how much they think, what the cost will be from the internal opposition, right? How is this going to affect their prestige on an Islamic world level? How is this going to affect them on the Arab world level? And how much resistance is this going to create for them already embattled in Yemen and elsewhere in these like needless and criminal wars that they're waging across the region and supporting across the region. Again, and because it's a difference of just formalizing something that already exists, the actual implications for Palestinians aren't massive. What's massive here is that it opens the door further to just global normalization of Israel as an apartheid state and saying that that's okay, right? And that's really what's really scary here, is this, remember when I said like now there's kind of no shame around it? This idea that like, oh, poor Palestinians, rahat alayhum, they've missed out, right? The poor things, right? And that's the thing that I'm worried about, is that people forget that this is an ongoing, real issue felt by people, an ongoing crime that's being committed with the passage of every second.
Thank you very much, Hazem. So the next question is, would you say that the revolutionary/conciliatory strategy battle is reflected in the turn within Palestinian advocacy in Palestine towards international law, or / the growing international human rights movement post 1967?
This is a really interesting question, Ella. I've actually written a piece on this on a shabaka that I couched about Palestinian narrative. Yes and no. The thing is that I'll just actually say kind of no in a way. Those are still two trends. Both of them use international law. Both of them think about arms and balance of power, etc. It's more about what is the framework within which you're doing international law and international human rights movements, post-67, etc. The BDS movement and the rights-based approach and this kind of thing was actually a way of sidestepping the Bantustan Authority, a way of sidestepping the prison warden that Israel imposed on the Palestinians in the form of the Palestinian Authority. Because the international state system only recognizes the person that they recognize as your like official representative, in this case, the PLO-PA, we ended up in a position after Oslo where our official liberation movement leadership was actually the prison warden and was taking sides with our colonizer. And so when we would go, to Sweden or to South Africa or to other places, and we would say, hey, you need to be boycotting Israel because look, the crime didn't stop just because they signed this bogus agreement. They would say, but who are you? Like, okay, you're Palestinians, but like, where's your official state representative? And so the recourse to international law was a very creative tool that Palestinians developed to say, well, actually, no, I do have standing to talk to you because you've signed up to this thing called international law, to things like the Rome Statute and to the United Nations and whatnot. And Israel's actually violating these, and you have legal duties. Yes, my official state representative doesn't give a flying rat's ass about my rights or anything else. They just want to kind of enrich themselves and have their VIP status in airports and play first line of defense for the Israelis. But there's still rights that are being violated, and you as Holland or South Africa or Indonesia or whatever have, or even a company that has invested in or university that part of its investment portfolio is Israeli companies, is to say, look, you're violating international law. It actually doesn't matter what the PLO or the PA are saying. You yourself are in violation. You are aiding and abetting a war crime and a crime against humanity and human rights violations. So there's a legal reason why you need to stop, right? This is very different from how the PA uses international law, right? So this is something to kind of keep in mind. So just keep in mind, international law is a tool. It's not all law. Like if any of you end up studying to become lawyers or whatnot, you may be called on to be the prosecutor or to defend the defendant. You're using the same law and it's used, right? So it doesn't exist as this kind of thing in nature that you either use or don't use or whatever. We use language that is legally, is legally intelligible. So we'll talk about forced population transfer, right? We'll talk about prolonged military occupation. We'll talk about denial of right of return. That's not necessarily how people at home think of things, right? We might think of things as like, I want to go home, not my right to return. But we will use this language because it's intelligible to others. What international law offers, other than a kind of moral baseline, is for us to kind of say, hey, look, this moral baseline, Israel is way over there. Like they broke this and every other part of this moral baseline. But it also gives us a language that's intelligible to someone in Zimbabwe, in the UK, in Italy, etc., that says, okay, there is an international language to speak about these things. How it's used, and it's going to be used by revolutionaries, and it's going to be used by reactionaries, and it's going to be used by people who think that they're sitting in the middle, who are actually reactionaries. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Hazem. Next question is, if both revolutionary and diplomatic anti-Zionist strategies didn't work, then what does? What do the increasing formal normalization deals reflect?
They're two separate questions.
Okay. Do you want to do the first one then? So if both revolutionary and diplomatic anti-Zionist strategies didn't work, then what does?
I mean, let's look at what we've done in the last 20 years to raise the costs. Like BDS has been immensely successful in educating large swaths of the global population and making it clear to Israel that there are costs. Like even if the Palestinian Authority isn't going to stand up to them, they will lose investments. Every time they bomb Gaza, more and more companies just drop Israeli companies from their portfolios, not because they're nice, but because there's agitation and activism that says you have to do this. Look at what they're doing with the weapons you're sending to them. And there's all of this pressure on Israeli cultural troops, and it's actually having an effect internally. You have more and more Jewish Israelis now saying, look, we're becoming a pariah, right? That's on one level of BDS, for example. The Great March of Return, right? People had forgotten about Gaza. People had forgotten that the largest open air prison in the world is in Palestine, and it's basically policed by Israel and Egypt, and administered internally by Hamas, and that there are people who are, and that the issue in Gaza became this humanitarian issue of, oh, Israel's not letting enough food and people aren't getting enough medicine, which are part of Israel's crimes for sure. But this is people in Gaza saying, yeah, we're not getting enough food and we are in the largest open air prison, but we all actually come from 20 minutes that way over the border. And our main issue is we want to go home, right? So not only did they bring attention to the issue of just the humanitarian plight of Gaza, which is dismal, right? They brought attention to the fact that this starving population that isn't getting medical care and people aren't even being allowed to go to universities that they've been accepted to because of the closures, the thing that they want actually is to go back to their villages and get their land back, right? And this is also what happened in the different kind of wall protests in Bil'in and Na'din, etc. This is what's been happening with all these different kinds of agitation and cultural work, right? Producing music, producing art, producing theater, producing writing that sensitizes, educates, provokes, gets people to ask the right questions. Because one of the crazy problems that we have is that people ask the wrong questions. Right? People are still asking one state versus two state type questions. People are still asking about where should the border be? Or like, if we didn't have the wall, what are we going to do about terrorism? Like questions that just don't have any relevance or any basis in reality are the questions people think are the questions that are important. We need to continually produce the kind of work and cultural work. Some of it is going to be agitation. Some of it is going to be confrontation. Some of it is going to be cultural production. All of it needs to be creative. Right? We need to keep in mind that part of what we're doing is there's no model for it. The old, like, let's go carry a Kalashnikov and train on how to throw a grenade, like from the 1960s and 70s, that proved its failure then, and it's proving its failure now. And this is not to poo-poo on any of it, right? It's not to say that those people who gave their lives and sacrificed their lives for that higher ideal at a moment where the whole of the global South was rising up against imperial chains. This is not to kind of disregard that sacrifice, but it's just to say that that's not, in the second Intifada, there were attempts to do this, and it didn't result in the liberation of territory, right? And so we need to be creative and think about what makes sense in our present context. And Palestinians do it, right? That's where BDS came from. That's where Great March of Return came from. That's where the wall protests came from. That's where so much of the incredible, even like hip hop and writing and agitation, like provocative cultural production coming out of Palestine is coming from, is imagining the future in a different way, imagining what activism and organizing and confrontation means in a different way.
Thank you very much, Hazem. So I've sent the link to Al-Shabaka website, so people can access some of the pieces that you've written. So if anyone is interested after this talk, I definitely recommend to go and have a read. So I'll move on to the next question. So this is a safe second question. What do the increasing formal normalization deals reflect about the current state of the Arab world and the path it's headed in of itself, not just in relation to Palestine?
Yeah, this is really I think the overarching issue. So thanks for asking that, Saif. What we are seeing is a move towards further normalization of identitarianism and effectively apartheid in what the new normal is, a normal of racism, mass policing, militarized police, incarceration, and that rift between the very rich who are also completely connected to what the state is and the legislative parts of the state are, and the vast majorities of the global population who are not that, who are increasingly impoverished, increasingly immiserated, and increasingly disenfranchised, right? I mean, the recent US election just shows how much of a sham these notions of democracy are, because it's not about educating the population. It's not about an educated population engaged in the issues that's then kind of debating and deciding on what kind of state they want for themselves. They basically get to choose between option A and B, and nobody was happy with what they were voting for, right? And meanwhile, the class differentials are like aggravated to the extreme. Patriarchy and abuse are kind of on the rise. This was the highest year on record for the murder of trans people. We just have, and then of course, all of the ways that COVID has just kind of aggravated all of this, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is, in terms of like international politics, what we're really seeing is that Saudi and the United Arab Emirates are trying to play the role of regional hegemon and effectively trying to take control over food resources and transportation logistics across the region. And so when we talk about the threat of Iran, there is no threat that Iran is going to like invade the United Arab Emirates. The threat of Iran is that Iranian shipping is going to compete with the United Arab Emirates shipping, right? It's an economic issue. It's all about bottom lines and profits and putting profits over people. What we're getting and the direction that we've already moved in, this isn't like this was the first step towards, this was the 50th step towards, and there's more to come. And it's up to us to decide what's our next move and who is us, right? We're still also dividing ourselves. Oh, he's Palestinian and she's Emirati and they're Egyptian. And that's their game. We're continually playing on their terrain of thinking about what divides us, how we're different from one another, and at best thinking about, oh, I support this, as if it's something kind of separate to you, right? As, oh, they killed Black people in the United States and there's too much policing and they have almost 3 million people in prison over there. It's not over there, right? This is one world that we're living in. And you really are either on the side of the people who just want to put profit over people, or the people who want to put people and the planet over profit. And Saudi and the United Arab Emirates have positioned themselves as a result of like massive resources and a kind of legitimization of authoritarian modes of rule, and increased closeness and proximity to the regimes that are at the heart of that system. So the United States, Israel, etc., to be the spearhead of putting profit over people in the way that the entire region is organized.
Thank you for that, Hazem. So another question is there a connection between this soul searching and reflection on national Arab identity that happened in the Arab world following the 67 setback and the current stance of Arab countries signing these normalization deals?
No, not soul searching. I don't think soul has much to do with it. It has a lot more to do with kind of pragmatic realpolitik. It's about readings of a balance of power, where the Arab states that were thinking of themselves as revolutionary, and where the kind of more reactionary side basically read a balance of power which saw the dwindling of Soviet power, the rise of US kind of market fundamentalism. Remember, the Camp David happens at the exact time when we switch into the neoliberal world order, right? Where we don't even capitalist states no longer appreciate unions, no longer appreciate minimum wage, no longer appreciate the notion that the state needs to also protect those most vulnerable in society. This all happened, this is Reaganism, Thatcherism, Mulroneyism in Canada. So there is no, it's not about the soul, it's about the pocketbook and about military arsenals and military capacities. So what happened after 1967 and the 1970s is that there was an understanding that on that military economic level, we're not going to win this game in the short run. And so the decision was this short-termist kind of thing of, well, if you can't beat them, join them, right? And join them means, and the United States made this very clear long before Trump was ever a political player, still when he was just trying to gentrify New York and build failed casinos in the 1970s and 80s. The US said, well, you want to join us, you need to normalize relations with Israel, right? And so it's not soul searching, it's a combination of a desire to be part of the global casino, and the external pressure that said, well, if you want membership in the global casino, then you're going to need to normalize your relations with Israel. Otherwise, we don't let you in.
Thank you very much for that, Hazem. So we've got a question here with quite a different perspective, I would say. So could normalization lead to a new, more effective negotiation with the normalized states acting as the mediators rather than the US?
I think that's maybe what they want to present themselves as doing, but absolutely not. No, that's not a scenario at all. Remember, what the PLO did in 1974 was it put all of its eggs into the basket of diplomatic power, leveraging diplomatic power. The diplomatic power that the PLO had was basically to say, okay, we'll tone down our demands down to the bare minimum of what some Palestinians might accept, which is a state on the West Bank and Gaza, in return for getting the Arab and Muslim and Soviet and Global South blocs to support diplomatically an attempt to kind of like arm twist Israel into some form of normal, acceptable behavior. That was the strategy, right? What's the scenario, like when you ask this question, what's the scenario where you say, well, actually, we're just going to give Israel everything it wants? How is that going to be leveraged into anything? That's just a decrease in what that reactionary Palestinian leadership was thinking it was going to leverage. That leverage is no longer even there. Israel's only game with Israel doesn't care about Palestinian resistance, whatever. They can eliminate Palestinian presence with an airstrike, right? They can really wreak havoc. Remember what kind of we're talking about one of the largest, most powerful, most well-equipped militaries in the world. They don't wipe out Gaza because they don't want to commit genocide in this outright way. They'd rather do it slowly, in a way that doesn't get that much media headlines and doesn't make that much of a headache for them, which is what they're doing, by the way, right? So you have this kind of gradual, slow elimination of Palestinians. What they want is normalization of relations with the Arab world. That's what's in it for them, these negotiations and this whole process. So if the Arabs just come in and say, well, no, we're just going to give it to you, then that leaves no power in the hands of that PLO leadership that wanted to leverage diplomatic power, right? And so now it's basically now just kind of expanding Israel's ability to say, well, you know how we said that our terms for your surrender are this? Well, now they're this, right? It's just to ask for more because the Palestinians are less and less powerful, have less and less going for them because they have less and less allies, right? Now we can officially talk. See, it's not just normal. In the case of Egypt, for example, it was normalization, Camp David. The Israeli the Egyptian military establishment continued to treat Israel as a foe, right? So they didn't allow, for example, for major like concrete deals to go through. For the building of the apartheid wall, etc. It's not a comfortable relationship. What the United Arab Emirates and Saudi and Bahrain are going for is an alliance. It's not just normalization or peace. It's an alliance. They want Israel to effectively underwrite defending Emirati interests in the region, like to deploy the Israeli military in defense of the United Arab Emirates. That was never something like if Egypt got in a war with Libya, it's not like it was on the horizon that they would ask Israel for help. Do you see what I mean? In the case of the Emirates and Saudi and Bahrain and whatnot, they're going for that maximalist thing of, no, we're family. Like you come and you protect me and we'll just invest money in your tourism sector and bail you out after COVID and stuff like this. So that, so no, this normalization is not going to lead to new or effective negotiations. It's just going to further destroy the negotiations. What is now more likely is that reactionary wing of the Palestinian leadership is going to rush towards more far-reaching surrender. And that's really worrying.
Dave, I think you want to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing to Bashir's question. Just to completely diminish any hope that these normalization deals do any good for Palestinians and might lead to a two-state solution, which in of itself is already impossible. The United Arab Emirates, the Emirati foreign minister, has explicitly said in his own words that anything Israel does in Gaza will not affect the UAE's relationship with Israel. Right, Israel could wipe out entire cities and neighborhoods, just destroy thousands of homes, and the UAE has already said it would not affect its relationship. And it is investing in settlements in the West Bank and in the Golan Heights, importing products from it. And even right-wing Israelis themselves aren't delusional enough to say that settlements don't impede the two-state solution, right? Everyone knows that. So Israel, the UAE by norm, like I think as Hazem said, it's not only not helping Palestinians anymore, it is now taking an active stance against Palestinians to destroy the Palestinians. It's taking action to destroy us. So no, there is no hope that this is any way good.
Okay, thank you. So last question is, so Hazem spoke about how several Arab Gulf countries need to normalize ties with Israel, even if in secret, in order to get on the US's soft side. So now Qatar has strong ties with Turkey and Iran, countries who would never tie themselves with Israel, but also have the largest US military base in the region. Do you think Qatar then also normalize relations with Israel in secret like Saudi, or just to have the US as an ally? And how did will affect Palestine and Palestinians?
Oh, this isn't an opinion. No, Qatar did normalize ties with Israel, just not formally. There was actually an Israeli trade office in Doha that operated for many, many years. And this isn't a secret. Like, this is pretty well known. I mean, it's like as much of a secret as Israel's nuclear program. You know what I mean? It's like everybody knows it, but it's not like Qatar was officially announcing or allowing them to fly the Israeli flag on their office or whatever. But there was an Israeli trade office, and we all know it. And we all know it because Qatar announced when it closed it. If we didn't know it before, you know it when we found out that it was closed. So when Qatar and the other Gulf states had their rift, and the blockade was imposed by Saudi and the Emiratis on Qatar, that was when Qatar shut down the Israeli trade office, and since then we have actually now seen a bit of a polarization. So it's, and kind of like to remind what I was saying and what Saif was just saying, we have two new blocks in the region, right? We have kind of like Qatar, Iran, Turkey, Hezbollah-ish, Syria, kind of parts of the Iraqi political system, the Houthis, as one kind of block. And doesn't operate so much as a block because it's not a very coordinated mechanism, and they all have troubles with one another, and divergent interests, and some of them are states and some of them are not, and whatnot. And then you have kind of the reactionary front, which very much operates as a coordinated block, which is the alliance, right? Remember, it's an alliance between Saudi, the US, and Israel, and the Emirates, and then their cronies, so Bahrain, Oman, Egypt, Jordan, now Sudan, sadly, and so and most of the other states that want a piece of the Saudi pie, right? I mean, this is also a big part of this story, is that Saudi money and Gulf money is something that all of these states think is there to bail them out of their own troubles. And so they're willing to bend over backwards to get it. And the Saudis know it. And and this, by the way, includes the US, right? The US is as greedy for Saudi money as anybody else. Anyway, so how will that affect Palestine and Palestinians? Qatar is, one of the only states that's actually sent any meaningful support. And this isn't out of a love of Qatar. It's just another authoritarian regime. But in terms of its foreign policy, it's one of the only countries that has sent any meaningful aid to Palestinians in Gaza, right? Like in terms of rebuilding hospitals and schools and things like that. I mean, Palestinians in Gaza will tell you, even if they don't like Qatar, that Qatari money is one of the very few sources of aid that's come in to help people actually survive, like actually on a day-to-day survival level.
Thank you very much for that, Hazem. So we've just got another question from Saif. So what should the Palestinian leadership do?
The kind of immature answer is they should all just resign and go home. Because they've failed miserably. Their strategy of leveraging diplomatic power to get anything from Israel has resulted. So, you know, some people will say, and will rightly say, that apartheid didn't end in South Africa. It used to be a political apartheid, and now it's just a kind of economic apartheid. It's still as racial, but kind of poor whites are affected now, and rich blacks are affected in the opposite way. But nobody in South Africa, as much as they will critique the current state of affairs in South Africa, will say, I wish we could go back to 1985, or I wish we would go back to apartheid. In Palestine, most people would say, I wish we could go back to the days of just straight, old-fashioned Israeli occupation. Life was so much better then. There was no wall. There was no restrictions on movement. We knew who the enemy was. You became a political prisoner with your head held up high. You had community mobilization and support for resistance and a steadfastness, and it was clear why we were doing it. Today, it's miserable. Like, we don't have proper anything in terms of infrastructure. We can't move. The Israelis have free reign to come and go as they please. We don't have free reign to do anything. Our leadership, who directly administer us, are supposed to be our allies and our leaders, but are the first line of defense for our occupiers and colonizers. And they're the first people to do coordination and security coordination with Israel. You know, when Israel comes into Palestinian areas, so into the urban centers in the West Bank, they basically inform the Palestinian Authority that they're going to do that. And then Palestinian police forces go and hide at home and in their barracks, so the Israelis can come arrest who they want and leave. Right? And so, so the best thing that they can do is find a way of effectively dismantling this diplomatic structure that they've created that enables Israel's settler colonialism to continue, right? They've become a fundamental pillar as planned under the Village League's days in the late 70s, early 80s, where the Palestinian Authority is effectively an extension of the Israeli military's civil administration by design, right? And now doing it willingly. So stop doing that is what I would say. Stop being an arm of Israeli apartheid and settler colonialism is step one of what the Palestinian leadership should do. By the way, also, when we say Palestinian leadership, there's more than one thing that we're talking about, but we can talk about that later someday. And then in terms of like the grassroots leadership, I guess that's the segue into this, in terms of people like you, right, who are like people who are involved in this in some kind of leadership capacity, is the stuff I was talking about earlier, is build our society's ability to stay resilient, right? Build on education of ourselves and of others, on developing creative forms of action that have an effect and raise the cost of settler colonialism and apartheid, but without incurring the major cost of huge swaths of our population being maimed and killed and imprisoned. I mean, the fact is that having a population that's 70% in the diaspora means that 70% of us or so live in places like the UK, where for now, at least, we still have freedom of expression and we still have the ability to talk to people about what's actually happening. We have the ability to go and do research and find the actual facts about what's going on. And the one thing that we have on our side is truth. Find that truth and spread it, right? The other thing that we have on our side is the moral side of the story, justice. It's a word that we've stopped using. We start using words like law and stuff, but we've forgotten this word justice. But there is a thing called justice, right? There is something that is wrong and something that is not wrong, right? There is something that is that allows for human dignity and for people to actually have meaningful lives without arbitrary fear of being arrested and maimed and killed and having their land taken, having their homes demolished. And we can advocate for that in many, many different ways. And they can be, and the more creative and the more impactful, the better. and all of them legal, right? This is the other thing that we need to remember is like, yes, they clamp down on our freedom of expression. Yes, events like this sometimes get shut down. Yes, all of this is true, right? Yes, the Labour Party just had a purge using some supposed definition of anti-Semitism that effectively just shields Israel as a state actor from criticism. And by the way, we need to take very seriously our own opposition to actual anti-Semitism, right? We can't just oppose anybody who wants to critique anti-Semitism. We need to be the first critics of anti-Semitism because it's the same logic. Racism of any kind is the same kind of logic that's being practiced against us, right? If Israel were truly fighting anti-Semitism in a way that saw anti-Semitism as part of the broader problem of racism and bigotry and xenophobia, then they wouldn't be the kind of state that they are now, right? But they only instrumentalize anti-Semitism as a tool of silencing criticism, and that's what needs to be opposed. But we need to understand, and by the way, now that fascism and the alt-right and identitarianism is returning, anti-Semitism is returning with it. And we need to be on the front lines of protecting Jewish people from it. Don't forget this, right? It's central. There's no point, if you're going to be just like pro-Palestine, but you're going to be kind of an asshole with everybody else, don't do this. Like, we don't need you. Yeah.
Thank you. So last question. US Secretary of State recently branded BDS as racist, anti-Semitic, and a cancer, as well as making plans to outlaw it completely. Are you worried about the impact that this may have?
Yeah, this has been around for a while. So the attempts to outlaw BDS and to effectively treat Palestinians' rights advocacy and kind of smear it with this kind of brush of anti-Semitism. I already mentioned it when I talk about Jeremy Corbyn. I just mentioned it now. One, educate yourself about the history of anti-Semitism and recognize that it's very real and very dangerous and needs to be opposed, just as much as any other rhetoric that calls for racism needs to be opposed, right? This is step one. Step two is understand what's wrong with what they're doing. The problem is there is anti-Semitism in the Palestine movement, right? We need to recognize this. And we need to recognize it, not just so that we can recognize it so we can push back on it. There's no space for that in our movement. Step one is to educate those people, right? If there's people like doing ridiculous shit, like denying the Holocaust or minimizing it or blaming things on Jews or whatever, like that, educate those people or distance them, right? If they're unwilling to be educated and to listen, then they need to be kind of asked to go practice their hatred elsewhere, because this movement has no space for that. This is step one. Step two, understand what the problem with what Pompeo is doing, what the IHRA definition. The problem with it is it does something very, very subtle. It just takes that definition of, the thing is, if you criticize Israel because and say that like, oh, they bombed Gaza because they're Jewish, that is anti-Semitic, right? There's nothing inherent to Judaism that says bomb Gaza. Do you see what I mean? If you see that the results, if you see that the crimes that Israel commits stem from Jewishness, that is actually anti-Semitic. I hope that this is clear, right? Because what you're saying is that it's inherent to Jewishness to do this. That's like one saying, like, of course there was this attack in Austria. Muslims are like that. You're effectively saying that there's something inherent to Muslims that makes them violent, right? That's Islamophobic, that's racist. Because obviously, like, there's a billion Muslims, there's millions of Jewish people. You're doing a blanket statement that then says that anybody that holds one of these identities is going to behave in a certain way. That's fundamentally what racism is. And also behave in a certain way that's somehow less than human, right? That's somehow monstrous or alien. That's why it's racist. What the IHRA definition and this Pompeo stuff is doing is effectively saying that any critique of the state of Israel is also, by extension, anti-Semitic. And that's where the problem is. What it does is it shields a state actor that has, you know, corporations and institutions and a military and an ideology that's quite destructive and a legal system that's patently discriminatory, and says we're just going to shield that because any criticism of it is anti-Semitic because this state happens to define itself as a Jewish state, right? So we need to understand that move. And then we need to defend ourselves. We need to educate people on how this is ridiculous. And some of our prime allies in all of this are actually Jewish people who are saying, you don't get to say that. I'm Jewish and I'm against the behavior of this state. There's nothing Semitic or Jewish about this state, except its own rhetoric about itself, right? It doesn't represent me. And we've had so many anti-Zionist Jewish people come out and say this, and they're really at the front lines of this fight, this particular fight. Right, and we need to make those alliances. Those are our allies. Those are our comrades in this fight. And so and it's clear to people, right? The problem is that like the more ignorance, the more these Pompeo type lines find support. And so educating people on what is anti-Semitism, what is not anti-Semitism, what this move actually does of shielding a state entirely from any kind of criticism, using this, understanding what happened to someone like Jeremy Corbyn as exactly tied to this, right? A lifelong anti-racist being expelled from his own party that he led on these baseless accusations, right? This is the kind of stuff, and I'm not rah-rah Labour Party, by the way, or even rah-rah Corbyn. But the fact that this can happen, and the fact that it's documented that the Israeli embassy in London was part of why it happened, is insane, right? This is really insane. So that's the kind of stuff to be worried about. There is a fear that certain states and certain jurisdictions are going to make BDS activism illegal. That needs to be fought. The thing is that things like the US Constitution, every time this has actually gone before a judge who's trying to implement US law, which is still quite progressive as of today still, it's been thrown out, right? Because any kind of attempt to silence criticism of a state, that's a restriction on freedom of expression and super legitimate expression. And so that's what's illegal, actually. So